So welcome to the latest ITESOFT Insider View. For this episode, we're once again joined by Jamie from VAT IT. So welcome back, and welcome back to all of you. Last time we were looking at legislation and especially the potential impact of Brexit. We're going to move away from that for this one and look back again at some explicit kind of customer success stories, and we're going to focus as a industry sector today, just for an easy way of hanging this together, on the pharmaceutical sector. So this covers everything from big pharma. You've got the manufacturing processes, you've got distribution, and obviously a huge amount of R&D that goes on at the bottom end of this as well, and how that all plays out and the impacts of that can be pretty high from a tax perspective. Jamie, give us a sort of couple of key points from this to get us going.
Cool. So we deal very heavily within the pharmaceutical industry. We have a client success story, $3 million worth of VAT refunded from 2013. Brilliant. So essentially that's largely, as you said, the R&D, the clinical trials. So essentially we had a company, they had issues with understanding the international tax landscape, their foreign exposure, and they conducted clinical trials. So there was an opportunity first for us to go and, as we would always do, we'll review their setup, whether they're set up compliantly, because there were instances where they were deemed to be having taxable supplies in certain jurisdictions. This was actually a US-based company, and therefore the first thing that we had to do was make sure they were structured compliantly. We helped support them through their local VAT registrations, and therefore actually about half of that $3 million worth of value was reclaimed within the refunds of that local tax mechanism where we'd set up that registration. Now the other half is through the clinical trials. So what you're doing is you're buying comparator drugs, you are shipping goods over to where you're conducting that clinical trial. So you've got that point that we've been working through on the movement of goods. And essentially there was just a massive opportunity to reclaim the foreign VAT on those accounts payable expenses. Now, sometimes what we can do for clients as well is, if say your largest companies that may have a setup abroad, it can happen, it depends on the size of the company and the setup of the finance team, you've always got to consider. There are instances actually where sometimes it's done in-house, and when it's done in-house there have been issues where essentially the local tax office queries or rejects a claim. Now that local tax office is obliged to give you information around that rejection, but when you don't have experts in the indirect tax field linked to the legality around it and being able to compose that response, essentially what we can do is, as well as doing it end to end, we can also pick up on anything that's been queried or rejected by clients to help them essentially with that resubmission to make sure they're maximising their VAT yield and their refunds. So there's really good opportunities for us, and as I'm sure I know you guys have pharmaceutical clients as well, so there are really nice synergies between us there.
Definitely, and I think what we find, there are some really big benefits that customers in the pharmaceutical industry can gain. There's an awful lot of product level information that has to be held. A drug is going to end up coming to a human, or in the veterinary world to a cat or a dog, or maybe to a cow that's then going to be eaten by a human. So tracking those individual, there's a whole extra level of compliance requirements around what you're tracking and how you're doing it. There are obviously really important matching rules and regulations around that, from a traditional three-way matching and so on and so forth. And we've done a lot of work with customers in this area. Let me give you one example where we did a lot of work. So they were looking for a solution. They had a lot of challenges. They had 46 people processing around about 1 million invoices annually. So big operation, lots happening from an accounts payable perspective. We work with them to support them in capturing invoices in what we call an omni-channel way, so multiple inputs, whether it's direct EDI from some of their bigger suppliers.
EDI is
electronic data interface, so pure electronic exchange, through to some emails coming in from some of their sort of more smaller ones, and then of course through to the paper ones still arriving through the post, and handling all of that for them. And then that matching process, automation of that, and really working with this organisation about how they could maximise that process to get the majority of their invoices from receipt through to ready to pay as quickly as possible, so that they were in a really good strong position in discussions with their suppliers to manage pricing from that perspective, because if you're paying well, your suppliers are much happier to negotiate pricing with you.
And if you're paying well, why not then recover the
And
VAT
exactly,
to improve your cash flow off the back of
absolutely,
that?
and you can start that process earlier, which is really important. This particular organisation, as I said, they had 46 people when they started looking at this project. Today they're running with less than 6.
Wow.
So, huge benefits for them there, and enormous returns, which immediately lead straight to the bottom line. And again, so whilst in this instance this is a bottom line recovery through reduction in staff, it's also, like you say, it's driving organisations to have that time and that ability to go, actually, these invoices are now ready to pay early. What can we do with that, as well as doing it with less people? Actually, now we've got time, we can think about this. We can use a company like yourselves to go, actually, well, there's other benefits we can do, aren't there? So,
and I think the beauty, when we spoke in one of the early sessions about that reduction of people and finding that place in the business for that skill set where there's always opportunity, the hardest thing to do is to find good resource, and sometimes that resource is sitting there right under your fingertips within your organisation, where you already have that engagement. And what a way to empower your people to then say, okay, well, you've been doing this, but we have all of these opportunities, and what else are you interested in doing, because we appreciate you and we want to bind you and keep you within our organisation and help us drive it forward.
Absolutely. And I think a second area which is really important, and we touched on it, is this compliance thing. You've got medical trials happening, you have drugs, these have got to be done properly, and there are an enormous amounts of rules and regulations purely on the compliance side before we even move into what can happen from a VAT and an invoicing perspective. But the level of complexity on just the compliance side is sadly mirrored on the VAT side, isn't it? It is not simple, and these are happening cross-border and cross regions, cross jurisdictions, that create that complexity. And the pharmaceutical industry, it's well known, isn't it? If you find the right drug, the profits are enormous.
Yes.
But the costs of finding the drug, you are investing in lots and lots of trials and lots of different drugs, most of which don't make it because they don't give the benefit or whatever.
And sometimes there's an impact where you've then got to wait a year to then do another trial on that same product. So there's also that time, cash flow piece as well.
So anything that these companies can do to generate that cash flow is of huge benefit, isn't it, to them? What other areas have you seen benefit from your customers?
So just in terms of industries, obviously we can assist across all industries. On the accounts payable side, the sort of power, energy space, it is a very big one for us. So that in particular, where actually, in terms of what we were discussing with previous examples around the automotive industry, obviously there are quirks and differences, but just in terms of the flow of goods, where is that service being provided, and how does that impact on your compliance around the international landscape? That's a very big area for us. But we will look also on the accounts payable side. A big area is your sort of meetings, events, conference, training. So if companies are setting that up internally abroad, there's an opportunity to reclaim there. Or if they're using an agent essentially to help them book those trips, sometimes that can be lost within that transactional flow, and we work with our clients to make sure that between all the parties, the client, which could be our client, the supplier, and the agent, that's structured correctly contractually to enable for the mechanism for a party to reclaim, which benefits everyone because it makes it more commercial to do that piece of business across that supply chain.
Yeah, and of course that sort of thing is particularly important in the pharmaceutical industry, where there's a lot of education that has to happen as well, isn't there, to bring the medical professionals up to speed with what these drugs are, how they work, what the results of trials are, and those are generally done through big conferences of drawing lots of people together. And as you say, and again, that's cross boundaries, and so on and so forth. And it's creating exactly that type of opportunity for VAT to be reclaimed.
And the key thing also with those sort of events is generally companies plan for them up front. So engaging with us early in that process allows us to make sure that the parties involved are structured correctly to enable for that, whereas sometimes it's very difficult when clients come to us too late to understand the implications to resolve it. So just always take that advice up front.
Absolutely, and I think that's critical with the whole process, isn't it, really? All organisations, one of the things we see with companies when we go in to help them put in automation and digitalisation of process is this is an opportunity to review what you're doing and look at it in a new light and look for best practice. And all companies often try and stick with their existing processes because that's how we've always done it. And you're right, stopping, reflecting, and bringing that in early is critical to having the best possible success, isn't it? And knowing that, and it's the same from a fraud prevention perspective, which we're going to talk a bit more about next week on our Insider View. But being able to stop that before it's happened is infinitely better than getting it wrong and then trying to claim all the money back. It's impossible, isn't it? So,
and if you're dealing with change management, and like change management is, if we don't need to hide away from it, it's one of the hardest things to implement in an organisation, to get that change of behaviour. But actually, if you're set up compliantly at the start and you're taking that right advice, that behaviour is far easier to infiltrate into the organisation, because essentially you're then developing a process for people to follow that first time round is compliant, and therefore that builds efficiencies into the process. It allows you to train them effectively within the organisation, and it makes that change management process, which a lot of people are just psychologically naturally scared of, far easier. And that's a big thing with automating your AP function. Just don't be afraid in this digital world of going for it and working with a trusted partner.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Well, look, thank you for that, and thank you for your time again. Thank you for joining us on this Insider View from ITESOFT, and hopefully you'll be able to join us next week when we do discuss the impacts of fraud prevention, and ways that companies can look at that, particularly also around their procurement processes. We look forward to joining you then.